The heavy oak door groaned on iron hinges, the sound dragging across the stone floor. It swung wide, revealing a chamber swallowed by low, flickering light. The air inside hit like a physical weight, thick with the sharp, acrid scent of melting wax and the sour, lingering tang of stale wine. Shadows clung to the corners of the room, stretching and retreating as the draft from the open door agitated the candles. Every surface in the space felt worn, from the scarred wood of the central table to the uneven, cold stone beneath the feet of those gathered. The silence was not empty. It was dense, pressing against the eardrums, signaling that the space had been held in this state for a long time. The door clicked shut, sealing the room off from the world outside, leaving only the dim, amber glow to define the boundaries of the chamber. The atmosphere was heavy with an unspoken gravity, a stillness that suggested the air itself was waiting for a shift. 12 men sat huddled around the scarred wooden table, their presence crowded and tight. Peter leaned forward, his torso angled toward the center, his calloused hands gripping the edge of the wood so hard that the skin over his knuckles turned bone white. He did not shift his weight, nor did he look away from the center. To his left, John sat motionless. He stared directly into the flame of a single candle, his eyes wide and unblinking, reflecting the dancing light. He ignored the movement around him, his focus locked on the burning wick. The others mirrored this unease in their own ways. Some tapped fingers against the stone floor, while others kept their heads bowed, their shoulders hunched as if bracing for a sudden impact. The air between them felt thin and strained. No one spoke. Every breath was shallow, controlled, and rhythmic. The collective gaze of the group remained fixed on the table, avoiding the shadows that pooled in the corners of the room. The silence in the room deepened, hardening into something brittle. Jesus shifted, his movements slow and fluid against the rigid, unmoving forms of the men around him. He did not look at the faces turned toward him, nor did he acknowledge the shallow, jagged breathing of those nearby. Instead, he reached out toward the center of the scarred table. His fingers found a piece of unleavened bread. He lifted it with a steady, measured grace, his gaze fixed on the grain of the crust. The room seemed to contract, the flickering light of the candles dimming as if pulled toward the center of his hands. He turned the bread over, his movements deliberate, devoid of any rush or hesitation. The disciples watched, their eyes tracking the subtle shift of his wrists. He did not speak immediately. He held the bread suspended in the air, the weight of his calm demeanor acting as a counterpoint to the frantic, unspoken energy bubbling beneath the surface of the table. He took a breath, a soft sound that carried clearly across the stone floor. He looked up, his eyes sweeping across the circle. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, and cut through the suffocating stillness like a blade. The words were quiet, yet they landed with a finality that made the shadows on the walls seem to recoil. He kept his grip on the bread, his hands remaining perfectly still, anchoring the entire room to this single, unfolding moment. The stillness held for a heartbeat longer, then shattered. Thomas surged upward, his wooden chair catching the uneven stone floor with a violent, screeching grind that echoed against the vaulted ceiling. The sound was like a scream in the confined space, jagged and abrasive. He did not look at Jesus. Instead, his head snapped toward the dark corners where the candlelight failed to reach. His gaze darted across the wall, tracking the shifting, distorted shapes that danced in the peripheral gloom. His chest heaved, each breath audible and ragged. The sudden motion acted as a catalyst. The other disciples flinched, their bodies jerking back as if struck. Peter's grip on the table tightened until his fingers cramped, his eyes wide and locked onto Thomas. The air in the room, previously heavy with a singular focus, now fractured into a dozen different directions of panic. Every man at the table shifted, knees bumping against the wood, eyes scanning the shadows that Thomas had just highlighted. The sense of security evaporated. What had been a contained, solemn gathering transformed into a circle of defensive, darting movements. Thomas remained standing, his stance rigid, his hands balled into fists at his sides. He waited for a response from the darkness, but only the low, rhythmic flicker of the candles answered him. The echoes of the chair's scrape faded, leaving a vacuum of sound that felt heavier than the noise itself. Jesus did not acknowledge the panic. He remained anchored at the center, his focus entirely on the unleavened bread held between his palms. With a motion that was both slow and absolute, he pressed his thumbs into the center of the loaf. The crust gave way with a sharp, dry snap that cut through the room like a physical blow. The sound was clean, final, and impossible to ignore. Every man at the table went still, the previous agitation freezing into a rigid, breathless anticipation. Jesus did not look up. He pulled the two halves apart, the fibers of the bread tearing with a soft, rasping friction. He held the portion out, his arm extended across the scarred wood toward the man sitting in the shadow. Judas reached out. His fingers were stiff, and as they neared the bread, a visible tremor ran through his hand, causing his knuckles to pale. He did not lift his head. His jaw was locked tight, his gaze fixed firmly on the grain of the table, refusing to look at the hand offering the bread. The silence held for a heartbeat, then the world outside surged against the room. A violent gust of wind slammed into the stone walls, catching the wooden shutters and forcing them to rattle against their frames with a frantic, rhythmic pounding. The sound was deafening, a sudden intrusion of the wild night into the claustrophobic space. Dust shook loose from the ceiling beams, drifting down into the candlelight like gray snow. The shutters groaned, straining against the iron latches, casting long, erratic shadows that danced across the walls and over the faces of the men. The stillness of the room shattered. The disciples began to move, their bodies twisting in their seats as they turned toward the noise. Frantic, hushed whispers erupted, a low-frequency hum of voices overlapping and colliding. They leaned into one another, their heads close, their eyes darting from the shaking window to the man at the center of the table. Confusion bled into a sharp, dawning dread. Every man at the table was now vibrating with the same restless energy, their hands clutching at their own knees or the wood of the table. Jesus rose from the table. The movement was fluid, yet it possessed a weight that forced the air out of the room. As he stood, his shadow detached from the wall, stretching long and jagged across the scarred wood until it swallowed the flickering candlelight entirely. The room plunged into a deeper, suffocating gloom. The frantic whispers died in the throats of the men, as if the sound had been physically snatched away. Jesus reached for the clay vessel. He tilted it, and the dark, thick wine flowed into the cup with a steady, rhythmic splash. The liquid was still, reflecting nothing of the room, appearing as black as the night pressing against the shutters. He lifted the cup, his hand steady, and turned his head. He did not speak. Instead, he locked eyes with each man in turn. He started with Peter, whose breath hitched, then moved to John, then to the others. His gaze was heavy, unyielding, and stripped of all comfort. One by one, the disciples fell into a state of total paralysis. Their hands, which had been clutching at the table or their own knees, went limp. The silence in the room became a physical weight, pressing against the eardrums of every man present. No one dared to shift. No one dared to draw a full breath. The flickering shadows on the walls seemed to pulse in time with the slow, steady rhythm of their collective heartbeats. Time itself appeared to have stalled, caught in the narrow space between the cup and the scarred wood of the table. The air was thick with the scent of wine and the metallic tang of deep, unspoken dread. Each disciple remained anchored to his place, eyes locked on the dark liquid. The tension was no longer just an emotion, it was a physical barrier, a wall of pressure that made the skin prickle and the muscles ache with the strain of holding still. The light from the dying candle sputtered, casting one last, long reach of illumination across the table before retreating into the gloom. Then the movement came. It was not a gesture of grace, but a final, deliberate act of closure. The cup descended. It hit the wood with a dull, heavy thud. The sound was flat, final, and absolute. It cut through the suffocating stillness, shattering the paralysis. The threshold had been crossed. The sound of the cup still vibrated in the wood when Jesus stood. He did not look back. He turned toward the heavy oak door, his movements sharp and purposeful. His silhouette, cast against the threshold, grew larger as he stepped into the doorway, framed by the encroaching blackness. The room erupted into motion. Chairs scraped violently against the stone floor, a harsh, discordant sound. The disciples scrambled to their feet, their movements uncoordinated and frantic. They stumbled over one another. The air in the chamber shifted as the door swung wide, admitting a cold, sharp gust that extinguished the final candle. Darkness flooded the space, turning the chamber into a void. One by one, the men crossed the threshold, their boots clicking against the stones as they moved from the warmth into the vast, uncertain cold. There was no hesitation. The gravity of his departure pulled them forward, dragging them away from the safety of the table and into the shadows. They moved as a single, ragged unit, their eyes straining to catch the outline of his form as he disappeared into the gloom. The door remained open, a gaping mouth in the wall, as the last of them vanished. The night swallowed them whole,